President Joe Biden, a sharing discussion event organized by American Corner UMY in partnership with VOA. Today's event also supported by IPOS and International Relations Department. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Tovan Fahrizal, and I am from the American Corner UMY, and I am here as your master ceremony for this agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, let me read our rundown agenda first. So the first agenda is opening, and then we will have a welcoming remark, a speech from the director of American Corner UMY. After that, we will have our main agenda, which is the presentation on journalist views on the election of President Joe Biden by our speaker, Mr. Nova Poewardi. And this presentation section will be moderated by our beautiful moderator, Ms. Hannah Nur Afifah Yogar. After the presentation session, we will have a Q&A section, question and answer section. And for those who are, for the Q&A section who want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and then introduce yourself first and then ask your question. But if you are not available to do that, you can also send or write your question to the Zoom chat Zoom chat section, to the Zoom chat item. Or if you are watching this agenda via Facebook streaming, you can ask your question through the comment section there. Okay, after the Q&A section, we will have a group photo session for our documentary, and then after the group photo session, we will have our last agenda, which is closing. Okay, now let's start our agenda by saying Basmalah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, move to the next agenda, which is a welcoming remark from the director of American Corner UMY to Ms. Mariska Intansari. The screen is yours.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Tovan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Hi everyone, good morning. I hope you are all safe and healthy. On behalf of the American Corner Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta, I would like to welcome you all to our program on the US election today, entitled Journalists' Views on the Election of President Joe Biden. This program is conducted in collaboration with the US Agency for Global Media, or USAGM, and this is not the first time we conducted programming with USAGM. Previously, the American Corner of UMY has also collaborated with USAGM in conducting the webinar on the US presidential debate. So I would like to extend my gratitude to Mbak Ningrum Spicer, Director of Asia Marketing Office of USAGM. Thank you for the collaboration in conducting this webinar. I do hope that we can always collaborate in conducting more programs in the future. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Mbak Dewi Arum from the Office of Business Development Indonesia, Office of USAGM, who has intensively communicated with us in preparing this webinar. Thank you so much, Mbak Dewi. And in this great occasion, please allow me to welcome Mr. Nova Purwadi, VOA TV producer and anchor on US politics. Thank you for being here as our speaker for today's program.
Thank you.
And we also have Ms. Hannah Nur Afifah Yogar, our former volunteer and also former Wisely academic fellow. Thank you for being here today as our moderator. She is currently a student in Chiang Mai University taking development studies, right, Hannah? Thank you for
My
being here
pleasure,
today.
Maria.
Okay. Also, we would like to extend our gratitude to My America Jakarta officers who have helped us by cross-posting this program on their Facebook account. Thank you, Mbak Okti and Mbak Endang. Last but not least, I would also like to welcome all our participants in Zoom and also our viewers for live streaming on the American Corner UMY Facebook fan page at amcorner@UMY, our YouTube channel at American Corner UMY, and also viewers on MAJ Facebook fan page. Thank you for joining our program today. Today's discussion is special because, as we all know, that the United States of America has just finished running their presidential election, which resulting in the election of President Joe Biden. After his inauguration on January 2021, Joe Biden is now the 46th President of the United States. And today we are going to have a discussion on the journalists' views on the election of this 46th President of the US. So without further ado, let's start the program, and I will give the floor back to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you. Keep safe and healthy. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, thank you so much, Miss Mariska, for your speech. Move to the next agenda, which is the main agenda of today's program, namely the presentation session by Mr. Nova Poewardi. And from now, I will let our moderator, Ms. Hannah Nur Afifah Yogar, to lead the session. To Ms. Hannah, the screen is yours.
Adi, thank you very much, Topan, as our Master of Ceremony for today's morning agenda. And I would like to also thank you for Mariska for letting me to moderate the sessions. And welcome everyone, especially Mas Nova Purwadi. I'm convinced I'm pronouncing your name correctly, right? Okay. Welcome everyone. For today's sessions, we will be having Mas Nova Purwadi. He has a very long experienced TV producer and also news anchor, and currently working for Voice of America or VOA at Washington DC since 2005 until present. Is that correct? Which is 16 years and 1 month.
Yeah.
Thank you, LinkedIn. And okay, we will also have 45 minutes for having his presentations. And before we are going to the main agenda, let me introduce him a very short and brief, because if all about him are being delivered today, it takes probably the whole day for only his introductions. So Mas Nova Purwadi is obtained his Bachelor of Science from Universitas Airlangga, majoring in International Relations Affairs, and also obtained his Master of Arts in TV Journalism from Goldsmiths College, London. And it's more interesting and interactive to have his introductions through the video, short video. And by saying that, I would like to request to the team of American Corner. Yes, please.
We take you now to Nova Purwadi, reporting live from the General Election Committee headquarters. Go ahead, Nova.
Thanks, Peter. We are currently entering the third day after the election results were first counted. We have with us in our studio today the Speaker of the People's Consultative Assembly, Mr. Amin Rais. Good morning, Mr. Rais.
Good morning.
Now,
we are joined by Nova Purwadi, a journalist from Indonesia's RCTI. Let me begin with Mr. Wahid.
Joining us by phone is Nova Purwadi with Indonesia's RCTI.
Now, this has, of course, security implications, and it also has political implications.
counting is set to begin immediately in New York and Washington, D.C., while polls are set to close soon in Houston and Chicago. Last to close will, of course, be the polling stations in the West Coast, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
Manova, tell us the latest updates.
Donald Trump is only 25 electoral votes shy of that goal, while Hillary Clinton, the path to 270 seems uncertain. Behind me is the Electoral College map that we also have on our website, voaindonesia.com, and it's being updated. On the day of the election, on the morning of the election, this could either turn out to be a blowout or a nail-biter. Well, the Biden administration, many analysts see, is going to be sort of a continuation of the Obama administration in terms of the approach to foreign policy, relying on allies.
Thank you very much for the beautiful introductions. Mas Nova Purwadi, I'm impressed with your long experience in working as a journalist, especially regarding to US politics for Voice of America. So as we know already, there is a robust magnet for US presidential elections, not only for the States, but also all over the world, including Indonesia. And we're really eager to have you to share your experiences, your work as a journalist, and giving your perspectives upon this topic. And also we are very humbled and delighted to have you for this morning sessions from Indonesia, of course, but night sessions for Washington, D.C. And ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Mas Nova Purwadi.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Mariska, and everyone in Yogyakarta and everywhere that's made this possible. It's very, very humbling to receive this invitation as well. I remember myself being in University of Airlangga. We had a similar thing to Amcor UMY. And I remember having to look for speakers to our events in Surabaya, usually involving the local consulate there. Voice of America didn't have that much of a large presence at that moment. It's compared to what it is now. The U.S. elections has certainly been very interesting, especially the past several cycles. And we always hear from our TV affiliates in Indonesia, whether national affiliates like RCTI, Metro TV, Kompas TV, CNN Indonesia, all those stations usually contact us whenever there's an election cycle. Those of you who haven't watched Voice of America, it's basically we're basically a publicly funded news organization. But although we're not part of the State Department, so they have no say in what we report as well. And we broadcast, unlike other agencies, through local affiliates in our target audience. So in Indonesia, we would work together with TV1, Metro, RCTI, RTV, and some local stations like JTV, other stations in Surabaya and other places, and that's how we broadcast to Indonesia, is through local TV affiliates. And of course, every 2 years, it seems, we are called to report about U.S. elections, because U.S. elections, the U.S. politics, is usually a constant state of campaigning, you could say, because every 2 years there's always an election. Of course, everyone's attention is always on the presidential election that happens every 4 years. And that one also involves elections for every time there's a presidential election. There are also elections for all members of the House of Representatives, the equivalent of DPR in Indonesia. All of them only serve for a 2-year term. So every 2 years, they are voted into office. And along with the along with the presidential election, there's also the election for the members of Senate. So every 2 years, there's actually an election. During the presidential election, usually people just call it the election, which involves the president, the race for the White House, and also all members of the House of Representatives, and also a third of the Senate. So you could say that American politics is always in a constant state of campaigning. It's always an election cycle, and then you still have some states and some areas which have off-season, so to speak, elections, including the state of Virginia, which had an election on 2019, where no one else had an election on that year. Now, as mentioned by Hannah, I have been reporting for the Voice of America since 2005, and that was the beginning of the second term of the George W. Bush administration. So I didn't get to report on U.S. presidential elections from the U.S. side or from Washington, D.C. then, but I did start to cover U.S. elections from stateside during the 2006 midterm elections, where a third of the Senate and all the House of Representatives members were up for grabs. All the seats were up for grabs. And then, of course, my first election was 2008, which ended with the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American to become the president of the United States. And that was a very contentious and also a very interesting election. And that generated a lot of interest in Indonesia, of course, because of his connections, his childhood in Indonesia. And so we had a lot of interest from Indonesian affiliates to the U.S. elections. The subsequent election, 2012, the subsequent presidential election, in 2012, that also got a lot of interest because it was Barack Obama running for re-election, still the connections with Jakarta and also the Indonesian connection, that also led to a lot of interest. 2016, I thought to myself, no one's going to be interested in this election. And boy, was I wrong, because we unexpectedly, of course, Donald Trump became the nominee for the Republican Party. And that, of course, sparked a lot of interest internationally due to his sometimes upfront and controversial nature. So what I thought would be a pretty mild or, sedate sort of election in 2016 turned out to be a busy election season as well. And 2020 also ended up being quite a busy election coverage as well. Now, of course, the challenges for 2020 was that the election was, for much of it, it was during the pandemic. So Voice of America, along with other news organizations, started reporting from home. I'm now basically speaking to you from my living room as well. And most of my reports for the Voice of America to Indonesian affiliates and to Indonesian viewers were also done in this very living room. The main challenge was travel was non-existent. Most of the events were virtual anyway, and there was no way in finding out details of the events, unlike previous years. Whereas previous years, months ahead, you would know where the venue was, where you were going to stay as the journalist, because usually Voice of America just books one hotel that all the journalists, whether from the Indonesian service or from Central News, from other languages, because we have broadcasts in Mandarin Chinese, in Khmer, in Russian, in Ukrainian, all of those Spanish, all of those usually stay in one hotel, and then we're all bussed to the venue, whether it's a party convention or a a campaign stop or somehow, there's usually that kind of organization and preparedness. And for the 2020 election, there was no such thing because no one actually knew what was going to happen until the very last minute. For instance, the Republican National Convention, people didn't know whether it was going to be in person but limited due to the COVID pandemic, or whether it was going to be virtual or semi-virtual, or how it was, or even where it was going to be held. Because initially it was going to be held in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then there was talk because North Carolina had strict COVID restrictions that it was going to be moved to Florida, and that was a bit of a uncertainty that caused us to be quite, it was a different situation to be in compared to previous elections where everything was pretty much set in stone, usually a year before and then certainly a few months before. And so that was one thing. And also little things like where the presidential candidates are going to be. Usually you already had some certainty over where they would be, and so it would be easier to cover them. And this time there was always a question mark up until the day of, usually it would be days or weeks before we actually find out the logistics of it all. But thankfully we were able to report that whether from location or from our home studios, like you see here on the latest of the U.S. elections. Now, I would say it. Aside from the challenges, there's also, as you can see in that video, I also covered Indonesian elections, starting with the last election of the Suharto administration. And then with the onset of Reformasi, I've covered pretty much all of the elections since then. There are, of course, major differences, both in terms of the mapping of political parties and such. Indonesia went from 3 political parties during the Suharto era to tens of political parties. The issue during the beginning of Reformasi was pretty much more disparate and divergent political forces vying for influence, whereas in the US, it's pretty much a bipolar situation where you have the Republicans on one side and the Democrats on the other. These are the 2 main political parties, and you'll notice that the presidents that have been elected tend to be either from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. There are also minor parties like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, but they've never managed to become president in the modern era. You see here one thing certainly that differentiates Indonesian elections and pretty much most elections around the world with US elections. You'll see this a lot. It's the Electoral College map. That's what it's called, and it determines the candidate who wins the presidency. You need 270 Electoral College votes to win the presidency. This was the result of the last election with Joe Biden from the Democratic Party winning 306 Electoral College votes, and Donald Trump winning 232 Electoral College votes. And so with 306, that is way above 270. And so Joe Biden won the presidency. He also won more popular, the majority of the popular vote, around 50-something%. His total tally of votes was over 80 million voters, whereas Donald Trump was around 74 million voters. So he did win the popular vote. which usually determines the elections, the presidential elections in other countries, including Indonesia. But in the US, that does not determine the winner. And one analyst put it as the US elections are not a popularity contest, because you could win the popular vote and still lose the presidential election. And that's happened a few times. Just recently, in 2000, with George W. Bush versus Al Gore, George W. Bush won by a mere 500,000 votes, 548,000, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, in 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by around 3 million votes, and yet still lost the election because she didn't win enough electoral college votes. And interestingly enough, the configuration was pretty much similar. So Donald Trump won 306 at the time, and Hillary Clinton won 232. Now, that is, of course, the major difference between determining the U.S. election winner compared to Indonesian election winner, compared to other countries, which is usually one man, one vote, one person, one vote. But, this also makes it kind of easier for journalists, because it is often much easier to call or project the election winner. Traditionally, it was done by election night, because what happens is, with the exception of two small states, Maine and I forget the other one. I should look at it. There's the exception, with the exception of two states. Most of the states, it's a winner-take-all thing. If a majority of the voters vote for a particular president, then all the electoral college votes, which basically the total for each state is the number of House of Representatives members, and the Senate, which has 2 members each for each state, they all go to the winning candidate. So that means you see here California on the West Coast to your right side is colored blue. So they swung for Democratic because all their 55 electoral college votes went to Joe Biden, whereas Texas, way to the south, their electoral college votes went to Donald Trump, to the Republicans. So that's why you see that. Nebraska was the one, I forgot. Nebraska and Maine, they divided differently, whereas all the other states, it's a winner-take-all situation where the winner of the state takes the whole state in terms of electoral college votes. So that usually makes it easier to determine by election night, only because some states tend to be Democratic leaning, like California, New York, and some states tend to be Republican leaning, like Alabama, Texas. So usually the focus on election night are in the so-called swing states or battleground states. Like on the Southeast, you see there, it's called Florida. That state is often quite a swing state. And also states like Pennsylvania, which was a solidly Democratic state for 6 successive elections, but in 2016 went for Republicans. So it became a swing state in 2020. And of course, Joe Biden ended up winning that state. But you'll see a lot of the states you can already, and of course, like exit polls, things like that make it easier. So usually by election night, you can already call or project the winner of an election. The exception is in those swing states. Now, what made it even more challenging, even more difficult this year aside from the coronavirus pandemic, is the large number of early voting and also mail-in voting. A lot of people, due to the coronavirus restrictions and also for fear of catching COVID, they opted for early voting and also mail-in voting. That they had record numbers. Most states had record numbers of mail-in voters and also early voters. And the problem with that in terms of counting is that most states only started to count those on election day and only after they'd counted those who had voted on election day. That's why in Pennsylvania, for instance, where you can only count the mail-in ballots and also after the elections and after counting the election day votes, you had a lag of time before they actually started to tally the votes. And that's why it was in many broadcast networks, it was marked as either red before with Donald Trump leading, and then suddenly there was a surge of Joe Biden leading. And that was because all of these early voters and mail-in voters, their votes started to be tallied afterwards. So they only showed up on the map around the Saturday. And of course, early voting and also mail-in voting also gained traction because a lot of people were concerned about the pandemic. They both in terms of not wanting to be in crowds of queues to polling stations, but also because of the economic impact. They wanted to participate in the elections. And so that was part of it. And the interesting thing is, of course, in the US, the election day is not a national holiday. Some states have holidays, but for the most part, if you had to work on that day, then, it would be hard to vote on the day. And to add to that as well, US elections are held on the first Tuesday of November. Now, why is it held on the first Tuesday of November? It harks back to America's agricultural past, where the assumption was on Sunday they couldn't do it because they were going to church. America was much more religious then. And on Monday, of course, they needed to start traveling to their polling stations, which were usually far from their homes. And they, rode horse carts. And so Tuesday was the best date, the best day to conduct elections. Now, it hasn't been changed. A lot of things in America are by convention. And so they've just been doing this for centuries. So the tradition has stayed that it's always the first Tuesday of November on election year, unless, of course, the first Tuesday is the first. So in 2016, for instance, the 1st of November was a Tuesday. So instead of having it on the 1st of November, they had it on the 7th, or either the 7th or the 8th, the Tuesday after. So that's why it's difficult. Unlike in Indonesia, where it's a holiday, a lot of people found it difficult to vote, and so they took advantage this year to vote by mail and also early voting as soon as they could, perhaps on a weekend or their off day, so that they could participate. Now, the participation level in 2020 was also quite high. It was in the 60s, 64 or so percentage. Now, that might not look like much compared to Indonesian elections, which are usually participated in by 80% or so people. That is a huge number in the US, not seen since 1908 or so. It was a really high turnout during 2020, part of it because people were concerned about the pandemic, and also because a lot of states had allowed these early voting and also mail-in voting. But of course, that made it much more difficult to report on because you don't have, instead of an election day, we ended up having an election week because we still had to wait for the tally of votes in states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and a lot of other states. Now, I said in that short video that it could have either been a blowout or a nail biter. It did end up being a nail biter precisely because we had to wait for a handful of states to count their votes and also have the winner projected. What may have made it easier would have been if, for instance, there was Florida. If Florida had gone for the Democrats, that would have made it easier to project because Florida counts their votes much quicker than the other states because they're used to mail-in ballots and such. If Florida had gone blue, then that would have made it easier. If North Carolina had gone blue, that would have made it easier. That would have been a blowout. But of course, as we knew, the election happened on a Tuesday, and the projected winner was only projected on the Saturday, which is quite rare because usually on election night you can already predict. And of course, what made it even more difficult was the fact that the incumbent, Donald Trump, he insisted that he had won already. And so there wasn't a concession speech and a victory speech on election night, but instead a dueling sort of narrative of who had actually won the election. Joe Biden, of course, wanted to wait for the tally. Donald Trump basically said he'd won and the election was being stolen from him. That also complicated things. And so that forced us to wait a little while, and also even unto, up to the, what's usually just a procedural administrative process, the actual electoral college meeting and also the certification of votes from each state. Now, what makes it even more complicated is the election in the US is, even though it's a federal election, it's a state-by-state system. So each state differs in its rules and also in how it administers it, how it certifies votes, and all of that. But what makes it easier here as well in terms of projections and such, the projections are usually based on the tallies made by a consortium of US networks. All US networks pretty much. And so you'd have US networks in unison project the state. For instance, Nevada going blue, or Pennsylvania going blue, or Texas going red. This is something quite established in the US and something that I know has not yet been established in Indonesia, because you would have different TV stations with different polls. There hasn't been a consortium of sorts to pool resources and also tally, so there's a clearer picture, or maybe a generalized picture of where the vote is. That is, I see what one of the differences. But of course, if the US elections were one man, one vote, we would also have to wait a little bit longer as well, because that means all the votes have to be counted, including absentee votes from overseas and all of that. And sometimes they could take weeks and such. And so that is also one factor to think about in terms of covering the elections. Another thing is, another difference, major difference is the last Indonesian presidential election, of course, also was conducted concurrently with the parliamentary elections, with the legislative elections. And also for each ballot, there was also many names for each seat on the House of Representatives in Indonesia, alongside all the other names for regional posts. In the US, that is not the case, because by November, by election day, usually the name of the person who is representing a certain political party has already been decided, and they are decided in what's called primaries and caucuses. So you'll hear about the Iowa caucuses, which are the first to occur, and then the New Hampshire primaries, and then you'll hear Super Tuesday, which is the primaries and caucuses that happen in many states. And those are the processes by which not only a presidential candidate is selected, but also legislative candidates are selected. So by election day, you don't have these many names on the ballot anymore. You only have one person representing Democrats, one person representing the Republicans, and perhaps some independents, some independents, some libertarian perhaps, some Green Party. But by election day, there's only a handful of names you actually have to choose from. In terms of legislative, federal positions, and senators and such, and also, of course, the president. Usually, it's only six candidates, and two of which are from major political parties, Republicans and Democrats. And so that's also one difference you see. So perhaps there isn't as much of a fatigue in tallying them all as well. In terms of the logistics of it all. So that's part of the difference in the election process between Indonesia and the US. And of course, in the US, I know in Indonesia several times before this, the legislative elections were separated from the presidential elections. And that is still the case in the US for elections in the midterms. So for instance, the next midterm is going to be in 2022. And during that election, as I mentioned, all members of the House of Representatives, 430 or so, are on the ballot again. And there are 34 Senate seats up for grabs, roughly a third of the Senate, which is the total number of seats in the Senate is 100 seats. So that's going to be all up for grabs in 2022, along with some gubernatorial ballots, some pilkada, so governors and mayors and attorney generals. A lot of those will be up for grabs in 2022. So that's why, Washington, D.C. is an interesting place to live in terms of it's always a perpetual politics. U.S. politics seems to be like a perpetual cycle that peaks every 2 years or so, but of course every 4 years is where the eyes of the world usually converged on the U.S., and that's when we're usually the most busy. But of course the Senate, the Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate is also important, despite not really getting much attention from international audiences compared to who occupies the White House, because issues like the budget, issues like arms sales, they also depend on approval or at least oversight from Congress. In terms of U.S.-Indonesian relations, now you have, as a result of the 2020 election, a Democrat in the White House, Democrats also maintaining their control of the House of Representatives. Democrats now in control of the Senate. And so you'll see a greater emphasis on human rights. Arms sales will be more under scrutiny in terms of human rights. You've already seen a shift in U.S. policy towards the civil war in Yemen. You've seen a shift in U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia, whereas the previous administration vetoed an attempt to block arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This administration is willing to review it. So you'll see more of an emphasis on human rights, and that sometimes complicates relations with other countries. We've seen that certainly in the past decades with Indonesia in terms of arms sales and how they are under scrutiny. And also when the Indonesian Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto visited Washington, D.C. a while ago, there was also scrutiny from Senate Democrats. But, you know, at the time, Senate Democrats were in the minority. Now they're in the majority. And so we can expect that kind of different dynamic in Indonesian-U.S. relations. Another perhaps interesting thing about the dynamics of relations between the legislative and the executive branches, the vice president in the U.S. Actually occupies a very important position as president of the Senate. And so that's why the Democrats now have control of the Senate. It's because Vice President Kamala Harris is also the leader of the Senate. And the way the Senate is now comprised, it has 50 Republican senators and 48 Democratic senators and 2 independent senators. But the independent senators usually caucus or basically join with Democrats in their vote. So you have an evenly split 50-50 situation, and Vice President Kamala Harris is the tiebreaker vote pretty much on issues on the legislative agenda for President Joe Biden. And so that is another dynamic which is unique perhaps to the American system. And so that's why here locally there's a lot of attention paid to Senate races and also congressional races, because it does determine whether a president can undertake his legislative agenda. We remember when President Obama was faced with a mostly Republican Congress, it was very hard for him to, especially in his last few years of his administration, to get anything done through Congress because it was under Republican control at the time. So all of these races are also interesting for a lot of us covering it in the U.S. And also, a lot of these races, there's also another saying that all politics are local. So let's say back in 2020, Mitch McConnell, who used to be the Senate Majority Leader, he is now the Senate Minority Leader because of the change in power structure. Mitch McConnell was also up for re-election in his home state of Kentucky. Now, a lot of people in Kentucky are not necessarily voting thinking of the balance of power in the Senate. They're thinking locally. They're thinking, has Mitch McConnell represented our state well? Has he pursued our interests well. So a lot of these things end up being local. And in Maine, the same thing. Susan Collins, who was the incumbent from the Republican Party, a lot of people voting in Maine won't be thinking about, is my vote going to swing the balance of power in the Senate? They're thinking locally, has Susan Collins represented me well? All of those things. So it ends up being an interesting thing, both in terms of being, it also, for us journalists, it makes us have to delve into local politics and local dynamics in terms of covering something which is on the national level. Several other states which had congressional races last year, senatorial races, South Carolina, and also Georgia, which ended up with the election of 2 Democratic senators, which handed the majority to Democrats, and thus providing some relief for Joe Biden because now he controls also the Senate. So all of these local races certainly keep us busy and keep us having to be fast on our feet about local developments along with national developments. Also, the top issues for elections are pretty universal, basically. Just like in Indonesia, economic issues usually top the list of things that people voters are most concerned about. And last year it was economics in relation to the coronavirus pandemic as well. You only started to see a difference once people listed things based on the level of priority they put on those things. Economics usually, the economy, jobs, all of that usually is number one. Same thing in Indonesia. Kitchen table issues usually dominate, and then you have other things in which the parties or the supporters of the political parties diverge, such as one of the most divisive is the issue of Black Lives Matter and police enforcement. Republicans are more for police enforcement, whereas Democrats are support police reform in terms of the how police approach crime and also how police approach people of color, Black Americans. And so there was a divergence in that. And also in terms of climate change, there's a divergence also between Democrats and Republicans. But in terms of what they most are concerned about is, of course, the economy. And I think that's it in terms of covering U.S. elections. And so I return it to Hannah, who perhaps has any questions or some questions from other participants.
Mas Nova Purwadi, thank you very much. What insightful sessions during your presentations. We have several questions over here, but probably I'm going to give you one by one. As you mentioned and you touched already, another essence of the US elections, for example, the behavior of the voters for the President of the United States. And in a special issue during the battles of the POTUS Biden and the former POTUS Donald Trump. In your perspectives as a very professional journalist, what kind of elements that predispose or influence the voters to choose Biden rather than Trump? For example, for the youths, you also mentioned that they're really concerned on climate change or environmental issues, but is there any specific issues that really bring the voters to choose Biden instead of Donald Trump?
Well, this was it was quite interesting, especially beginning at the beginning of the cycle during the primaries and the Iowa caucuses and such. There really wasn't an agenda, so to speak. There were 24 or so Democratic presidential hopefuls, of which Joe Biden was only one of them. So it was interesting because at that time, each Democratic presidential hopeful presented themselves as the antithesis of Donald Trump. Basically, they were running against Donald Trump, but they were presenting themselves as the anti-Trump. But there was no cohesive in terms of what they wanted and such, and it was still mired in the internal factional fighting between the progressives who in 2016 had coalesced around Bernie Sanders. And the same thing happened this year as well, Bernie Sanders, but a few also veered towards Andrew Yang and a few other lesser known candidates. And then the moderates who coalesced around figures like Joe Biden. But, you know, the coronavirus pretty much changed everything and changed the dynamic of everything. And the coronavirus and also the lockdowns happened pretty much in March, so around this time last year, and they occurred just around what was then Super Tuesday, when many states held their primaries and caucuses. And by then, all the moderates had decided to back Joe Biden. And then, so Joe Biden actually gained new momentum during that time. And subsequently, of course, he drew focus on the coronavirus pandemic and how there wasn't a federal response. Whereas Donald Trump focused on the economy as it was before, and also law and order. And it seems with some voters, the issue of the coronavirus took on a more important, became a more important issue, so that they chose Joe Biden. Here's the deal as well, though. You see a lot of states still going for Donald Trump. States like Texas are rather immovable, just as California is pretty immovable, being very heavily Democratic state. But a lot of Republicans have learned to separate, and a lot of Democrats as well. A lot of Republicans who voted for Donald Trump have learned to separate personality from policy. They may not like his midnight tweets. They may not like what he says about certain groups or his political enemies or anything. But they agree with his policy. His policy trade war with China, his policy of law and order in terms of handling crime, his and some of his one major thing which won over a lot of evangelicals is, of course, and of course I know a lot of people in Indonesia, and certainly a lot of UMBA students are of your particular concern, is his decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the U.S. embassy there. That won him over with a lot of voters. So a lot of voters have learned to separate policy from personality, but apparently with during the election, enough voters in enough swing states ended up choosing Joe Biden because perhaps they thought he was better to handle the coronavirus pandemic. You have some of the surprises during this election were in states like Arizona, which hadn't voted for a Democratic president in a while and ended up swinging Democratic. Nevada also, and also Georgia. The last time Georgia voted for a Democratic president was 1992 with Bill Clinton. And Joe Biden ended up having a slim lead there. So that was a surprise as well. It's basically a lot of dynamics, but the coronavirus pandemic seemed to have been a major deciding factor in people's decision to choose Joe Biden. And of course, Joe Biden won back a few of the Rust Belt, so to speak, states that were lost to Democrats in 2016, including Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, his second home state because he was born there. So apparently they won back a lot of the working class people who were turned off by the Democrats in 2016. I hope that answers your question.
It's completely answered my questions, Mas Nova. And another question is coming from participants. We know already that Vice POTUS Kamala Harris is the first American Asian and the first woman to become a vice president. Another interesting question is it become fetish for the U.S. politics, especially for the team of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, or probably creating a new issues because some people are really concerned. This is America and you're Asian and American, half and half. Is there any challenges aside from racism that faced by Kamala Harris, or is it become new opportunities become a fetish for U.S. politics, Mas Nova?
Well, it's not only Kamala Harris. The Biden administration is known as cabinet members and such, is now being touted as one of the most diverse. You have the Secretary of Defense is African American, and so is the UN, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and you have more women. You have more ethnic minorities and all of that. Now, this is also a tension of U.S. politics at this time as well. You have the politics of inclusion and also diversity, which means, and also representation, which means someone like Kamala Harris represents diversity and also inclusion and representation of both Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and also African Americans, also Black Americans. So there's that angle as well. But the other side also accuses that of being identity politics. So, choosing a woman, choosing an ethnic minority. So that is accused of being identity politics. Because you're Latin American, that you shouldn't choose Republicans because some Republicans are discriminatory towards Latin Americans, towards Hispanics. But that's identity politics, So there is that tension every election. And of course, the Democrats tend to favor inclusion, but the Republicans would accuse that of being identity politics. Same as also, I feel in Indonesia, the equivalent is in the use of religion, whereas, it could be, is it inclusion? Is it representation? Or is it identity politics? Just because you're Muslim, you have to vote this way. Just because you're Christian, you have to vote that way. It continues to have that tension of, do you have a female Black Asian vice president just because she's a, so yeah, there's always that tension in U.S. politics now.
Okay, Mas Nova, we're moving to another questions. The question is coming from Dewi. So she asked, how was the enthusiasm of the American youth in 2020 U.S. presidential elections?
It was actually high, and a record number of young voters actually voted. I wish I had the percentage points, but it is much higher than, it ended up being much higher or close to the figure seen in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. That election was electrifying to a lot of youth. He was one of the first internet, social media savvy candidates. He was also the first African American who ended up winning the presidency. And so he galvanized a lot of youth. Apparently this year, the youth voters also came out in droves. And they also came out in droves voting early from the polling data. And, there didn't seem to be that much apathy as there were in previous elections. Possibly also the pandemic helped to galvanize the youth as well, because no one is basically spared from the pandemic. Even if you still had your job, there's a heavy toll that the pandemic takes on youth voters as well. And so they actually voted in very large numbers. The interesting thing is, of course, the selection of Kamala Harris seems to have excited a lot of the same youth voters as well, because just as a lot of young voters complained that their choice was between one old white man and another old white man, now at least with the Biden-Harris ticket, they had one old white man with a Black, Asian, biracial woman at the ticket. So that's the enthusiasm, perhaps, of the youth voters in 2020.
Interesting, Mas Nova. And we heard that there was advanced declarations from former POTUS Donald Trump. He was declaring that he won the election at the time, even though the voting is still going on at the time. But what we see that there is a similarity between Donald Trump and also Prabowo Subianto in Indonesian election, because both of them were declaring the same thing. Do you think they both are having similar concern they are winning the elections? I mean, probably because they are pretty confident to say that, or is there any something behind in your perspectives as a journalist for digging a lot of information during the elections, Mas Nova?
This is very, very. This was totally, a lot of developments during the Trump administration were unprecedented in terms of both what happened and also us covering it. And there were just so many. We just never knew what was going to happen next. So with the refusal to concede, no one knows whether he actually has his own data that he thinks could prove that he actually won in these states that he claims he won. But as we know, he sent scores of lawyers to several of the battleground states, including Pennsylvania, Georgia, and all of these lawsuits were basically dismissed for lack of evidence. So it's still hard to figure out what is the reasoning behind the refusal to concede, and also the insistence that the election was stolen. Now, what's also interesting in terms of dynamics is the extreme polarization that's occurred in the US, similar to what's happened in Indonesia. Extreme polarization that you've never seen before. Before, a Democrat and a Republican would disagree about taxes. They would disagree about economics. They would, let's say the stimulus package. A Republican would be like, oh, we have to give more incentives to the business owners. Otherwise, everyone suffers because they're going to have to lay off a lot of people. And then the Democrats would be like, no, we have to, we have to give more cash. We have to give more BLT. We have to give more direct cash check stimulus to each taxpayer, especially poor taxpayers, And then they would still go out for dinner. Not the case these days. It's similar to the kampret cebong dynamic in Indonesia. So it's similar to that polarization, extreme polarization that's happened in Indonesia. You see people unfriending each other, blocking each other on social media, all of that, and so you're left with pretty much friends who only vote. In the US, you only end up with friends who voted for Joe Biden, or you only end up with friends who voted for Donald Trump. So that's the similarities in that. And of course, you do still have people these days who voted for Donald Trump. A lot of people who voted for Donald Trump say, okay, so yes, we supported him, but yeah, Joe Biden actually won the election. But you also have some who believe that, Joe Biden didn't win the election, actually win the election, And the difficult thing is, of course, the polarization, because each side just doesn't talk to each other anymore. And it's hard to convince people to think otherwise, So there's a lot of similarity, and a lot of it is driven by social media as well. A Pew Research Center study last year, close to the election, said that a fifth of U.S. voters get most of their political news from social media. That's the general population. For young voters, 19 to people in their 30s, it was 48%. So about half of young Americans get their news from social media. And of course, as we know, social media, you can just post anything. And so that has also led to the sharp polarization, which is similar to Indonesia as well.
So we could say kampret and cebong also.
Yes.
Also living in
there are U.S. kampret and cebong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. We have some questions here, but I'm just trying to generate, Mas Nova, because it sounds the same. So the last questions must be: is there any common sense of leadership between POTUS Biden and former POTUS Donald Trump, or there's becoming extreme changing in terms of policy, or probably the leaderships of the president of United States of America? Is there any common sense, Mas Nova, or it's completely different, both of them?
Well, there's always continuity and change, especially in foreign policy, I would say, but sometimes in internal politics as well. Now, you could, in terms of each individual, there are, these are two really contrasting people. Donald Trump was an outsider. He was a businessman. He was a celebrity, and then he came into politics rather recently, and so became president. He brought that kind of style into government as well. distrustful of institutions, and overseas he was distrustful of alliances, including NATO and all of the other alliances. Joe Biden is a lifelong politician, and that was held against him during the campaign. But also, that's how Joe Biden is. Now, I'm about to reveal my age. I was born in 1973. When I was born, Joe Biden was already a senator. So Joe Biden was a senator from 1973 to when he was tapped to become vice president of Barack Obama in 2008. So he's been in public office very, very long. He knows the way the government works. And so the major change has been, he's been selecting people who know the way the government runs, like Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State, he's basically been a lifelong diplomat. These are the types of Janet Yellen, who was formerly the head of the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, so to speak, as Secretary of Treasury, Finance Secretary, pretty much. So he's chosen these people who have experience in their fields and also in working the government. That is the major difference. Whereas Donald Trump, we remember the first Secretary of State he had was Rex Tillerson, who was an oil executive. So this is the difference in both style and both the way the government functions. Now, will there still be continuity? Yes, because in terms of facing China, for instance, you will see the Biden administration still somewhat tough on China, especially on issues like the treatment of the Uyghur population, Hong Kong, its actions in the South China Sea, which also affect Indonesia. So you'll see the rise of China still being something that is viewed with suspicion and also with alertness from the Biden administration. You won't see them suddenly 180 degrees all friendly with China. And also you'll see a more institutional approach to foreign policy. When his foreign policy team announced America is back, what they meant was America is back and willing to engage with its allies, with alliances. Donald Trump was known as tougher on allies than he was sometimes with Vladimir Putin of Russia, with Kim Jong-un. He was very tough on NATO allies. But conversely, he also took a more personal approach to Xi Jinping and also Kim Jong-un, whereas Biden is more likely to take a more institutional approach, government to government and official to official, and also alliances. And so in terms of China, even though he will still remain tough on some issues, probably more willing to cooperate on North Korea, for instance. And also with Russia, the US has just issued several sanctions towards Russia, but so the relationship is tense still, but it also still wishes to engage Russia in relation to Syria and other things. So there is continuity, especially in foreign policy. Foreign policy, I would say, doesn't change as much as domestic policy, but certainly domestic policy, you saw a slew of executive orders on day one, reversing a lot of the executive orders that the Trump administration has issued, including the so-called travel ban, even though it's just travel restrictions affecting mostly Muslim majority countries like Yemen and Syria. And you see, a more centralized effort in terms of COVID, both in the vaccine distribution, and there's a more concerted federal response, just as he promised. That was also different compared to the previous administration, which basically allowed the states to decide. But the commentary on that was, if you just allow the states to do whatever they see is best, it's like being in the same pool, but because America is pretty much a contiguous, it's not an archipelago like Indonesia. It's like being in a pool and you allow one person to mess up the pool. Everyone's going to get the mess, when it comes to the US. So there has been a more concerted effort that way, and there's been several changes. But yeah, continuity, especially in foreign policy.
Okay, Mas Naval. I said this was the question will be the last one, but there is a private message coming to my my Zoom. This is about the Trump impeachment, Mas Naval.
Mm-hmm.
And we also recall the memory that there was a riot in U.S. Capitol at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any influence, or probably is there any public trust issues during the U.S. Capitol riots to both Trump impeachment cases and also the way President Biden is touching this kind of specific or serious issues about Capitol riots?
Well, that was certainly interesting, because it ended up being the first time a president was impeached twice. And what complicates it is because the first time was late 2019, early 2020 was the first impeachment over two allegations regarding the relationship with Ukraine and investigation into Joe Biden. This time it was during the Capitol riots, and it was only one count of incitement of insurrection. So this is the first time, and the first time a president has been impeached twice, and certainly the first time a president who's left office has undergone an impeachment trial. It's interesting to see the dynamics of this. And the second impeachment, actually, a few Republicans, 10 Republicans in the House of Representatives voted to impeach, and several also in the Senate voted to find him guilty of the charges. But the strange thing about because impeachments have happened before in South Korea, Brazil, other countries. And usually when a president is impeached, he's basically fired. In the US, if a president is impeached, it's basically just the first step. So the House of Representatives votes to impeach a president, and they act as sort of the attorney general or the prosecutor, and they prosecute the case before the Senate, who acts as a judge. And so with the second, you'll notice during the whole tumultuous transition from December to January, Joe Biden, who was then president-elect, did not comment as much on it, and he just went about the business of announcing his cabinet, announcing his priorities, COVID priorities, and then announcing his disparate teams, foreign policy, finance, trade, all of that. And so he didn't really comment much, but he did comment after the Senate voted to acquit former President Trump. Yes, it's certainly an interesting development. And we also have, despite acquitting him, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, saying that this doesn't mean he got away with something. It's because, basically he may have been alluding to lawsuits and others that are pending. And last I read, there was actually at least one congressperson who was filing a lawsuit against President Trump. So it's not the end of the consequences for that. And then several state, also the state of Washington, the capital area of Washington, D.C. is, I think, either considering or has already filed suit as well. So there's still those kinds of consequences. It just is not an impeachment consequence. And there was also a question of the constitutionality of impeaching someone, a president who has already left office, because there's basically no implications unless the Senate also votes to bar him from running again in 2024, which he intends to do, and also to strip him of a lot of the benefits he gets as a former president, including a security detail from the Secret Service and all of the other benefits. So it certainly has been interesting, and it's not, as we saw in his recent comeback speech at a forum in Florida, there's still, Donald Trump is still not going away. So we'll still hear from him, but not in the daily in your face that he was when he occupied the White House.
All right, Ms. Nova, thank you very much. It feels like I got 6 credits of lectures from the university. A lot of things I got, and I believe everyone is as well feeling the same. And that's really the last questions. Yeah. And before I give back to the Master of Ceremony, let me sum up the sessions with Mas Nova Purwadi for today's webinar, which is we also touch several points, really important points, like the mechanism of the elections, both the US and also Indonesia is quite different in some parts. And also the Biden's elections bring some policy shifting, especially with the economics things and then healthy matters because of the COVID pandemic, as well as the environmental concern as well. And also there is something that really obvious. We can see that there is identity politics, as mentioned by Mas Nova, in conjunction with Vice President Kamala Harris, because she's the first female vice president and also Asian American vice president for the US. And also, we also touched the issue on the confidence of both Prabowo Subianto and also Donald Trump for declaring their election winning, but then it's the opposite one for the result. Yeah, there are a lot of things from our discussions with Mas Nova Purwadi. Mas Nova, thank you very much for being us today's morning and nights in Washington, D.C., of course. We hope you are in a good health as always, mentally and physically healthy. And thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today as well. And I'm giving back to the MC, Hana as moderator. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Toban, please.
All right. I would like to say thank you so much to Mr. Nova for your interesting and amazing speech presentation and the lively question and answer section. And then I would like also say thank you so much to Miss Hannah for the moderator today agenda. Okay, so before we close our program today, I would like to invite everybody to open the camera to have a group photo session. So we will have 3 poses. So I will count it when you guys are ready. Okay, guys? The others? All right. Should we take now, or we'll wait for others to open the
I
camera?
think we can just take the photo now.
Okay, Miss.
I'll take it. You count, right?
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, change to other pose. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the last pose. 1, 2, 3.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Miss Mariska. Okay, now we are in the last session of today's program, which is closing. So let's close this